Hello and welcome to There's No Business Like, a podcast where friends and industry colleagues explore topics and interview leaders in our industry of professional theatrical touring.
Welcome back to There's No Business Like. Josh here to let you know that we are changing up format a little bit, just like we told you we were going to. This week, we feature an interview between Katie and James Shapiro of Columbia University, author of The Playbook, a story of theater, democracy, and the making of a culture war. I will let this interview speak for itself, and then next week, some of us will be discussing this interview and what that means within the current landscape of the performing arts, discussing some of the topics and subjects kind of around censorship and what's happening in the United States right now. Enjoy this interview with James Shapiro.
I'm James Shapiro, professor of English at Columbia University, where I've taught for 40 years. I've written a number of books about Shakespeare and about theater internationally. And I work with theater companies, the Public Theater, where I'm a Shakespeare scholar in residence, for many years with the Royal Shakespeare Company, and currently with a Broadway production of Othello that'll open in March.
Excellent. Well, Jim, thank you so much for being here on There's No Business Like. It's such a pleasure to meet you and to talk to you today. Really excited to have this conversation today.
It's a great thing you're doing, and the people listening are the people I need to reach.
Well, thank you. We are going to dive in here in just a moment. But before we get into your book and our topic at hand today, I do want to know just a little bit more about you to give our listeners some context. How did you, very briefly sort of get into the world of theater and the world of literature and get to where you are today?
I'm embarrassed to say I never took a Shakespeare course in college. I hated Shakespeare in high school. After a bad semester of Romeo and Juliet in 10th grade, swore I'd never study Shakespeare formally again. In my late teens, I started going to London at a time where you could see plays for 50 pence a day and sleep in church basements or youth hostels for about the same. And Freddie Laker, through Laker Airlines, flew people over for $99 round trip from New York.
Oh, wow.
So I'd hold down some crummy job, and in August, I'd fly over and see 20 or 25 plays that month. And I'd come back every year and do the same. And by the time I was 21 or 22, had probably seen 200 Shakespeare productions, a little stoppered, not much else. And all of them are still tattooed in my head to this day.
Fantastic. And that sort of started you on your path in scholarship then around Shakespeare and around the theater.
It did. Most Shakespeare scholars are interested in Shakespeare on the page. And I've always been interested in Shakespeare on the stage. So the books that I've written, or theater in general, I love theater. I could happily go to the theater every night and throw in a couple of matinees as well. It's something I know, I deeply feel, and have spent really my adult life writing about it, thinking about it, and worried for it.
So let's get into your book. I found a piece of yours in the New York Times from last year about censorship in high school theater, and that sort of led me down the James Shapiro rabbit hole. And I found this book that you published in last year, just in 2024, called The Playbook, a story of theater, democracy, and the making of culture war. So what makes a Shakespeare scholar like yourself interested enough in art censorship to spend a lot of time, and this is a very thoroughly researched book, you can see in the appendix, write a whole book about this period of the arts and government history that feels largely overlooked and forgotten, which is, the 1930s, the creation and the ultimate demise of the Federal Theater Project, which was part of the WPA. So what made you want to write this book? How long did it take to research it and write it before it was published last year?
My main contribution to Shakespeare scholarship, I've written about 8 or 10 books, but the most successful book was a book called 1599, A Year in the Life of William Shakespeare. And it won the Best Nonfiction Prize in England. It was called the BBC Four Prize then. Now it's called the Baillie Gifford Prize. And it won the best of the first 25 years of best books last year. And it took me 15 years to write. And in that book, I could tell you the weather in March in London in 1599. I could tell you what it felt like walking the streets because I read everything written in or about those times. And I followed that up with another book called 1606 about Shakespeare's Jacobean career, the year of Lear and Macbeth and Antony and Cleopatra. So I spent really 25 years understanding Shakespeare's world and the political context in which he wrote. And then Donald Trump was elected for the first time. And I realized that I had to shift my gaze from looking longingly across the Atlantic to the politics and culture of my own society. And it goaded me into writing what for me is a trilogy of books. The first two are done. I'm working on the last. The first book was Shakespeare and a Divided America, which looked at episodes in American history from the founding up through a production at the Public Theater 6 months after Trump was first elected, in which right wing activists attacked the stage, ran on stage, disrupted the procedures, threatened the actors and the director and the director's family. I wrote about that in the closing chapter of that book. It was a production of Julius Caesar in which Caesar was a Trump like figure, and the right wing didn't like that. What I didn't realize at the time was I was a dress rehearsal for January 6th. That book led to the Playbook. And I thought, I'm not only going to write about Shakespeare, but I'm going to write about theater in America and its complicated history, because anybody listening to this show knows that few art forms disappear into the ether as quickly as theater does.
Yes.
Rehearsals don't get recorded. You see a production, there might be a couple of reviews, the runs are always constrained. It's gone. And all there are memoirs distorting things 30 years later. So I thought, why not tell a story that has been told before in different ways? I knew that the young Orson Welles had professionally directed a production of Macbeth with 150 Black actors at the Lafayette Theater, not far from where I live, in the 1930s for the Federal Theater Project, about which I knew next to nothing. And I thought, well, why don't I kind of start looking into this? And the great advantage I had was that the Library of Congress and the National Archives had almost all of this archival material. A couple of universities did. Vassar College had. George Mason University was central in this. They all photocopied and sent stuff to me, or digitally or by mail, and archives in Texas as well, where Martin Dye's collection is. It took shape against the background of the political crises through which we're all living and the theater crises through which we're living. I watched on a daily basis as one small or medium sized theater across America after another shuttered during COVID, failed to come back after COVID. So I realized that the history of the decline of theater in America had a history, and the disappearance of theaters in America had a history. One of the most shocking things I discovered in this book was you could buy a really fat guide in 1900 or 1906. It was an annual guide to every playhouse in America.
I know. When I read that, my mind was blown.
In addition to the ads that are placed in there, you could see, you pull into a town in Nebraska. Nebraska had 50 theaters at this time.
Amazing.
And you could tell what the electrical hookups were, the seating arrangements, how much tickets went for, local hotels to put up your actor, train schedules coming in and out. Theater was vibrant.
And this was all before radio and film, right? That was the entertainment medium
Absolutely.
of the United States.
Radio's 20 years away, and then the movies came. And the movies, kind of like a plague from the perspective of the theater, wiped out
Right.
theater culture overnight, because it was cheaper to see a movie than it was to see a play. And you could convert all those playhouses and opera houses into movie theaters. And you suddenly had a lot of unemployed actors, stage hands, stage managers, directors, producers. They were all gone. They were still alive, but they were all gone from a theater. And almost overnight, within a decade or so, people stopped going to the theater And when the Federal Theater came back into existence from 1935 to 1939, one of the things they did at the first 2 years when they had a little more money was survey how many people had ever been to the theater before. 2/3 of the people had never seen a play before, a live play.
Wow.
I describe an instance in Nebraska where people hung out at the stage door because they didn't believe these were actual human beings
Real
acting,
people. Yeah.
right? They, let's just see if they're
Right.
real or whether this is some kind of newfangled projection.
Thank you for that context. That is super helpful. And I think you document beautifully sort of that transition from theater to radio to film in the course of the book. And so I really encourage people to read that and learn more about that. Before we talk history, and I want you to walk us through sort of the creation of the Federal Theater Project and forward, I do want to recommend that listeners get a copy of the book or listen to it on audiobook. I will tell you, I could not stop gasping and exclaiming and reading passages out loud to the friend I was sitting with at a coffee shop while I was reading portions of the book. The history is really fascinating, and the social and political landscape of the time that you write about is shocking. So I just want to encourage people, because we can't talk about all the details today, but I do want to encourage folks to get a copy of the book. That being said, let's dive into the history. So can you give us the 10,000 foot overview of the history, sort of why the Federal Theater Project was created, all the way through Martin Dies Jr., sort of that history, and then we're going to dive into how it connects to our current moment today.
Between 1935 and 1939, the Federal Theater Project staged over 1,000 productions in the 27 states that still could mount productions, which was seen by 1 out of every 4 Americans, which is a shocking set of statistics. And the personnel for this theater, or the 12,000 or so unemployed theater folk whose livelihoods had been eliminated by the movies. A handful of people moved to Hollywood and tried to get in there, but only a few did. So you had across the country all these people who belonged to stock companies in every small, medium, and large city and town in the country that work with stars traveling through. Every leading American actor played through America, so that it wasn't just Broadway and Hollywood. Theater culture extended everywhere. So let me take 2 steps back and talk about why and how this was created. And an underlying argument of my book, which is becoming increasingly clear in 2025, is we like to think the culture wars began in the 1960s with the civil rights movement and with women's rights and queer rights and the Vietnam War. But almost everything that is being unraveled right now was a creation of the New Deal under President Roosevelt, FDR. And if you look at the initiatives that Trump's administration is now undertaking, it is rolling back everything. The last couple of things are Social Security and other bedrock New Deal accomplishments. So there are only 7 New Deal entities left, and they've been attacked for years, and now they're under severe attack. The first New Deal entity to be eliminated in the culture wars was the Federal Theater Project, which was eliminated by Congress in 1939. Let me go back to its creation to explain why such a remarkable entity as this, really a national theater that was bringing plays to kids in playgrounds, to communities of Germans and Italians and Spanish immigrants. This was not a time where we said English is the only language spoken here. The Federal Theater was giving Germans and Italians theater in their own languages, a Yiddish theater for immigrants who spoke Yiddish.
So, I found that so surprising and so fascinating and frankly uplifting.
It was a remarkable thing and obviously a threat, but we'll turn to that threat in a little bit. This was a moment in the 1930s where, if we can all stretch our imaginations to believe this, the government believed that the arts, as much as industry, or agriculture deserved federal support, was crucial to American democracy, because democracy, going back, ancient Athens created democracy and theater, and those two have always been interdependent. You don't have a strong democracy without a strong theater. And you don't have a strong theater without a vibrant democracy. You just have to look at autocracies, places like Orban's regime right now, and frighteningly, and we can turn to it, the Kennedy Center and other entities in the United States right now. You need both. They're mutually supportive and dependent. So Roosevelt reached out to one of his right-hand men, a guy named Harry Hopkins, who was brilliant at organizing relief. What I mean by relief is, this was the Great Depression. Millions were out of work. You either cut them a check or give them work. Not everybody could dig ditches. If you're a violinist, somebody shoving a shovel in your hand is not really going to help you or help build that road. So Harry Hopkins figured out that it would be useful to create what came to be called Federal One, which was an umbrella for a federal theater project, a federal writers project, a music project, arts project, historical research, and put unemployed people back to work doing what they did: concerts, murals, and the like. And of course, theater, which was the largest entity. And by the way, the expense for all of this 5 years and 1,000 productions was the cost of building one battleship. So it did not cost a lot. People were paid a living wage and not much more. So Harry Hopkins reached out to a classmate of his from Grinnell College. Her name was Hallie Flanagan, and she's really the hero of my book. Hallie Flanagan probably would have lived a life of good housewife in the Midwest, but her husband died, leaving her with two boys. One of the sons died as well, and she had to earn a living. So first she adjuncted, as we would call it, and then she got a fellowship based on one of her plays to go to Harvard to study for a year in their great graduate program in theater. And on the back of that, two good things happened to her. She was one of the first women to win a Guggenheim, and she spent it traveling through Europe, seeing what experimental theater was like there. And she got a job at Vassar College, where she created an experimental theater for Vassar women. Vassar was a single-sex school. She could have spent her days serving out her years teaching Vassar students to put on good theater. But Hopkins called her, rather than any of the hyper-aggressive Hollywood or New York types, to run a federal theater. She was middle American. She didn't bring a particular political view. She was progressive, but most people were, as the President of the United States was, and Congress was largely at that time. And he persuaded her to create this theater. Now, anybody who's ever run a theater who's listening now knows how hard it is to put together one season with, a bunch of actors and a couple of directors. She had to first figure out who was alive and where they were living and putting in for relief to be part of this federal theater project, then organize them into regional theaters, and somehow start mounting hundreds of productions nationally a year.
Yeah.
And then you have everything from actual communists who are trying to promote radical left-wing productions, which she kept pulling back from or curbing, to right-wing spies for the right-wing media who are being paid to read her mail and savage Hallie Flanagan and her entity. I know none of this sounds familiar.
There are a couple of plot twists towards the end that I was not expecting, and I don't want to necessarily give those away. Again, reason to read the book. So Hallie becomes in charge of this theater. She's recruiting people. I was really fascinated by how you structured the book. So you sort of do the intro of the history, you give the histories of a handful of the most notable productions, and then we sort of get into Martin Dice Jr. and the House Un-American Activities Committee work. Two artistic things I wanted to ask a question or sort of point out. You sort of say the only notable sort of artistic form that came out of this was the living newspaper unit that was like really different and sort of had any sort of lasting impact. So I'd love for you to tell us just briefly about the living newspapers, and then also the tactic used by, they launched at least two productions nationwide with performances all opening on the same night. And that seemed tactical to me in a way of not only drumming up publicity, but also ensuring that everyone would get to see the show at least once before it got shut down.
When the living newspaper derives from really left-wing Berlin and Moscow theater that she had seen, but because there was suspicions of overly lefty connections to the theater, it was sanitized a bit. You had a lot of unemployed journalists as well. So they teamed up with the Federal Theater. And you have to understand, you can't employ 12,000 unemployed actors if you're doing two-handers or three-handers. It
Right.
doesn't work. So how do you create a play that employs 150 actors or 180 actors or 110 actors? You create these massive newsreel type stories. Arthur Miller, who got his start in the Federal Theater Project and was on the payroll, later wrote that in the 30s, people didn't really have the historical consciousness that they did in the 1950s. So these living newspapers, which was what you see is what you get, it was kind of like stage stories, told stories like, this is a story of slum housing in New York. And it begins with a fire on stage, which would have me running for the exits, and
Right.
ends with a fire on stage, and was appalling and showed using newspaper clippings and legislative documents how terrible living conditions were in the United States. And beautifully, when this show went on the road, let's say they went to Philly, Philly's slum housing was different. They had collapsing structures. So they retold it not from a Jewish Lower East Side story, but from black tenements. And it led to legislators being forced to spend money to fix substandard housing. They did plays on, sexually transmitted diseases. You're not going to get a Broadway producer to do plays like that or a
Right.
Hollywood. It was brilliant and thrilling. And the second question you asked was about the shows that went on the road. The best one was It Can't Happen Here. And that occurred because Sinclair Lewis, one of the most popular writers of the 1930s, who was married to a journalist who had interviewed Hitler, came back and said, "Dear, it's going to happen here soon." Because America in the 30s, like America in 2025, had a lot of right-wing fascistic neo-Nazi types itching to take over the country. And Sinclair Lewis wrote this beautiful novel about a town of Vermont at a time when people were rounded up and put in camps after a fascistic president took over. Jews were punished, women were put in the homes, back in their places, blacks were rounded up and abused, and there were concentration camps in America. And it was going to be a great Hollywood movie. He sold the rights. His last two films for Hollywood had made millions. But, and I won't give away the story, it's in the book, the film didn't happen. So Sinclair Lewis reached out to Hallie, or Hallie rather reached out to him, and he said, "Sure, you can have this." And they decided to push back against the movies. They would open this across the country on the same day in 20 or 30 theaters. And each theater would get to kind of shift the story to its own needs. In Tampa, it was in Spanish. In New York City, downtown, it was in Yiddish. It was beautiful. And it did open every day on the same day. And Americans from Seattle to Maine got to experience a world in which it has happened here and fascists have taken over the country. And, there was great trepidation that the Hearst papers or reactionary forces in Washington would stop this. Hallie Flanagan's shutting down the ideas in Detroit to use a Hitler type figure in the poster for the show. There was just such fear that this would be shut down in
Right.
Chicago.
Right.
It didn't play in Louisiana because of its own local leaders were fascistic, and Huey Long had recently died and the like, and he was considered one of these folk. But it was a great example of the strength of theater to reach across America on issues that matter to everyday Americans, and at a time when you didn't have a college educated
Mhm.
public. But people could go to the theater,
Mhm.
see the story, and say, I don't like what's happening to my democracy.
Yeah.
So you can imagine the people who like the status quo, who like blacks and women in their place, who didn't like the elites and those New Yorkers and intellectuals and Jews and immigrants would push back.
Also, so not only is it a creative force and it's addressing, these shows are addressing everyday issues and things that are so important to regular everyday Americans, it's also integrating the theater. So both casts were integrated and audiences across the country were also integrated, which is one of the things that gets brought up in the hearings that we see with Martin Dies and later in the 30s. So all these sort of pinpoints and things that they were doing, which were beneficial to the public, eventually caused the downfall of the Federal Theater Project.
Exactly. So let me tell I'm interested in conflict because drama is about conflict. And my book is different than other books on the federal theater because I set the story up as a collision of two federal entities. One is the Federal Theater Project, and the other is the House Un American Activities Committee, which most people think kind of dates back to the 1950s and
Yeah.
McCarthyism, but had its roots in the creation in 1938 of the first House Un American Activities Committee. As you read, I talk
Mhm.
about the debates in Congress where people said, hold on a second, who gets to decide what is un American?
Yes.
The Senate and the House were obsessed. They didn't go to the theater, but they were obsessed with theater. And they were particularly obsessed with instances like a black actor asking out on a date a white actor, and she complained to her Mississippi senator who would shut this down. People were
Mm-hmm.
lynched for less.
Mm-hmm.
Let me tell you about the House Un American Activities Committee. It was led by a man named Martin Dies, who, in many ways, was Donald Trump before Donald Trump. Bounced around, couldn't find the right way to gain power, landed on every political view from far left to far right you can imagine, became a tool for more powerful people, including the vice president serving under FDR, who didn't like, John Nance didn't like Roosevelt's progressivism. And he found himself in a position of authority to be chair. He
Mm-hmm.
was from the second congressional district in Texas, where blacks couldn't vote, and poor whites had to pay a poll tax. So he was elected by a very tiny proportion of well-to-do people in his district, and he realized that he only had 7 months to run this short-term congressional committee, underfunded because nobody in Congress trusted him. He was allowed, but he was charismatic. Went through 7 cigars a day during hearings, had his kid come up and light a cigar from him from the audience. He understood how to manipulate emerging media better than any American before Donald Trump. And he did that. And he used the press and he used Congress. And
Mm-hmm.
he realized if he got the people on his side, in those 7 months that his committee was authorized to perform its work, he could prolong the life of his committee. So he had to go after low hanging fruit. And the lowest hanging fruit was the Federal Theater Project. And he went after it with a vengeance, violating every congressional tradition and guardrail because he knew guardrails were flimsy and could be knocked down. And as long as he had popular support, and the earliest Gallup polls created at this time showed that he had enormous popular support.
Mm-hmm.
And the end of the story, the spoiler alert, is the House Un American Activities Committee lasted until 1975,
Yeah.
and the Federal Theater Project died in 1939. I mean, there was a production of
Mhm.
Pinocchio downtown. The word came to the actors. They changed the ending, kind of buried Pinocchio. He didn't come to life at the end of the play. And all these props and scripts and posters were put in boxes, given to the Library of Congress, and shipped away who knows where
Mhm.
until the 70s, where two intrepid scholars from George Mason said, "Where are these things?" and found them in an
Wow.
abandoned airport outside of Baltimore.
Wow. It's a striking story. And like you said, the title of the book, the playbook, right? You sort of lay out how Dies does this, from manipulation of the press to manipulation of his fellow Congress people to capitalizing on the lack of attention the public was paying to what was really going on, because they were concerned with their own lives, right? They had kids to feed and jobs to find, and the war was barreling down and things like that. So there was this whole mix of factors that led to this moment. But a couple of observations. He was able to, one, twist language and intention, putting it under the umbrella of communism, right? So he used the word progressive, integrationist, anti-corporation, liberal, anti-fascist, right? Creating an inaccurate story of what was actually happening, all in the name of rooting out communism. And it struck me that, like, in a lot of the pull quotes from different articles, publications, the House itself, these hearings, if you replace the word communist with the word trans or LGBTQ plus, it would read exactly the same.
Absolutely.
So the the echoes are eerie and spooky, and it echoes what we've heard in the last 10 years from one part of our country, right? Not everyone, but so with that being said, can you draw the line from when the Federal Theater Project ended to sort of our current moment? The things that have been happening with the Kennedy Center and the NEA we're a few weeks into that, right? So we've had some time to sort of take it in and process it. It feels like this can't happen here, but you demonstrate that it actually has, right? This has already happened, but so many of us weren't alive then or haven't experienced it to this extent. So let's draw that line from that moment to where we are now. And how are you seeing what Martin Dies did play out today?
The first thing I would say is the reason I called my book The Playbook is not because it's about those playbooks that were created by the Federal Theater. They put on old plays and they commission new ones, but it's because it is about the creation of the playbook now used against the arts and theater in particular. Martin Dies created the playbook that those dismantling the arts in America right now are using for all the things you said: use of the media, manipulating populace, figuring out how to use disinformation or lies or testimony to destroy the arts by labeling them communist. It was not a communist theater. And Hallie Flanagan was not even able to ask somebody whether they were or were not a communist. It was legal to be a communist. So the playbook then is the playbook for Project 2025. And Martin Dies very cannily, a feral figure, figured out that playbook that has been so useful to acolytes ever since. Lyndon Johnson, who famously signed off on the NEA and NEH in the 60s, voted as a young congressional figure to end the Federal Theater Project.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the lessons that the NEA learned was spread the manure, spread the money across the United States into every congressional district
Right.
so that they can't shut us down again.
Economic development, right? You're putting dollars back into every district. Every representative is going to want that money back.
Exactly. So that was a canny move on the part of those behind the NEA. But that is not enough right now. And I can assure listeners that even in the most repressive regimes, whether it's under communism or Nazism in Europe, artists have always managed to produce
Mm-hmm.
art, samizdat, or other kinds of art. Art is not dying, but access to art is, and control of the arts is. The decision by Donald Trump recently to take over the Kennedy Center And his promise to transform what's being performed there has really been a kind of clarifying event. It's not just the Renee Flemings who won't perform there, but I think you're going to see significant boycotts of that institution by leading artists who refuse to allow the radical politicization of art
Mhm.
that's implied when the President of the United States decides he's deciding what art Americans should see there.
Mhm.
And we're witnessing NEA applications that require a repudiation of anything that smacks of what they call woke or DEI, which is basically human experience as most people experience it. And
Mhm.
it's having a really chilling effect. I said earlier on that I'm writing a trilogy of books. The third book in this trilogy is a book written for the Black Lives series at Yale University Press
Mm.
that David Blight and Skip Gates are overseeing. And it's called Othello, An American Life. They've asked me to write a biography of a fictional character. And Othello's
Interesting.
story is America's story, whether it's slave ships named Othello or the first American named Othello who's executed on Chambers Street, a few miles from where I sit, or the denial of Ira Aldridge to be allowed to play Othello in the United States. He has to go to Europe to do that. So I'm trying to write a counter history of America
Mhm.
through a character, through theater. At the same time that Donald Trump has decided the 250th anniversary of our country is going to be celebrated with a pro American
Right.
celebration and the efforts to eliminate counter histories. So I'm interested in insisting on counter histories. So far, the government has not been able to suppress publishing. So my publisher, Yale University Press, will, I hope, go through with it. But truly, nobody knows what is next thanks to the playbook.
Why not just slash funding for the NEA? Why put that sort of stipulation on the grant programs to support work about the 250th anniversary? Like, what's the intention behind that, do you think?
The intention behind that is not unlike, say, the intention behind any repressive government. I was a Fulbright scholar in Israel. I'm concerned about the state of Israel. The Israeli government is not interested in allowing certain kind of voices in their theaters to speak about the conflict there in certain ways. And I'm sure any theater that's going to be receiving government support, and ticket sales, as everybody knows, is never enough to cover the expense
Right.
of running a theater,
Right.
is going to be told you can't do X, you can't do Y, and the next thing they're going to be told is you must do A and you must do B.
Mm-hmm.
And when that time comes, every one of us is going to have to make a choice about how we push back against the government's use of theater and use of the arts to promote a political agenda. If a billionaire or two is listening, the amount that the NEA spends on theater is a rounding error for you. I would love to see Mike Bloomberg or somebody else. Mike, if you're out there, please cut the check. Subsidize the arts because look at the most recent NEA report on the percentage of Americans who see a play in a year. It is negligible. We're back to 1930. We're back to a moment where theater is negligible in the lives of most Americans. In part because it's $500 to see a Broadway play, and in part because teachers are no longer teaching plays in school according to
Mm-hmm.
curriculum, and students are no longer getting the support to put on plays. In that op ed I wrote for the Times, the censorship in various states about which plays can be put on. I was at the Charleston Literary Festival of late, and I was interviewed by a journalist because the local legislature was discussing whether to ban Romeo and Juliet. And that from the schools. And that is a terrifying prospect. And I asked the journalist, let me get this straight. You don't like the dirty bits that Mercutio speaks and nobody understands anyway. But 70% of your kids are watching porn or sexting every day. And that's okay, but this is not.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that there's going to have to be support from deep-pocketed individuals who realize that you don't just support democracy by cutting a check for your Democratic officials or the billions that went to the failed Harris campaign, but you put it into grassroots. And I'm not arguing for a leftist theater. I'm arguing for a theater that deals with the things Americans face. I can imagine a theater in Louisiana tomorrow putting on a play or commissioning a play about the Trump administration's decision this week to allow a company that pollutes massively and kills people in Louisiana through their pollution, do a play about that. That would be a perfect federal theater play. And you know what? That's terrifying to the powers that be. Because if locals went to that theater and saw that play and saw the cost of deformed babies and people dying young, they would say to the legislators, we don't want this. And that's the way to change this country. People think of theater as something unnecessary or a luxury item. If you want a democracy, you invest in theater.
I think that's a perfect note to end on. Jim, thank you so much for your time.
Great
Thank
conversation.
you for
Thank you, Katie.
You're
Got
very
a little
welcome.
worked up here, but it was worth it.
I appreciate your time. I appreciate your expertise. Good luck with Othello and your rollout of the further rollout of the book. I think this is something that everyone in our performing arts community needs to read. Thank you for writing it.
My pleasure, and fight the fight.
We hope you enjoyed that interview. Catch us this Saturday as we drop a little bonus episode of a little bit of content from the original discussion that Katie and James had around Othello and the production that's coming out. And then catch us next week as we discuss this interview, as well as some things happening in the United States right now within the arts field, along the lines of censorship and what that looks like to us today.
All right, everyone. Thanks for listening to There's No Business Like. Our producers and hosts are Brian Zelmer, Josh Benson, Kevin Maynard, Katie Miller, and me, Danielle Van Hook. Views expressed in this podcast are ours alone and are not reflective of the organizations we are a part of. Keep up with us at nobusinesslike.com. There you'll find links to all of our episodes and socials. If you like this podcast, give us a like, a follow, a review, or our favorite, a 5-star rating. Oh wait, what was that site? I got it, don't worry. It is nobusinesslike.com. Do I sound out bus-I-ness every time I type it? Yep, sure do. Stay in touch, my friends.